Welcome to Education in Focus. I'm your host, Eliana Kernodle. During a congressional hearing on civics education last week, Democrats stated that K-12 students do not receive instruction on critical race theory. Republicans disagreed and asked witnesses pointed questions to show the framework is in schools. Joining me to discuss this is Chalkboard News editor Brendan Clary. Brendan, this seems like it would be a simple question, whether or not it is being taught. What's the divide here?
Yeah, so the divide is sort of it's been a long-standing divide. We've heard from advocates who stand behind critical race theory that it's not taught in K-12 schools and that it's never been taught in K-12 schools, because what they define it as and what it is sort of at its root is a legal framework that's taught to graduate students. I mean, we're talking 800-level law courses, right? So these are for people, and it's a theory of, for those who are maybe not super familiar with critical race theory, it's like a theory of looking at institutions, right, governmental or otherwise, and looking at them critically to try to figure out, like, why do we see differences in outcomes? Like, why is there inequity in the world today? And basically it comes to the conclusion that that's because of racism. Like, even if people are not inherently racist, that some of these institutions are inherently racist. And so that is sort of the premise that it asserts. And then it asks people to look at those things critically. Like, why does the government treat people differently? Like, what are the, longstanding things? What are the outcomes leading to? And so, the proponents of critical race theory then are defending it. And there's been in recent years a lot of conservative backlash and sort of intentional demonizing of critical race theory. And I think that one of the posts that's often brought up is one that was on Twitter, now X, by Christopher Rufo at the Manhattan Institute. And he basically said, we're gonna talk about critical race theory in such a way that people are gonna know it and we're gonna go after it, essentially. And so that was sort of the war cry against critical race theory. And since then, I think there's been a lot of parents who have been concerned about that. There's been a lot of different states who've taken that on. I mean, there was in the first Trump administration, there was an executive order related to critical race theory. There's been a lot of states who've passed legislation. So anyway, like, that was kind of, the background here. And throughout that, a lot of proponents of critical race theory and that ideology have said that it's not taught in K-12 schools. But then the more complicated question is, like, does that influence policies that are being used or implemented in schools? And that is what witnesses and Republicans at the congressional hearing were asserting. Essentially that you have schools that are implementing professional development or other kinds of activities to show students and staff that there is racism inherent in the institutions in which they live and in which we have built our society around. So we need to do everything we can to try to stop that. And so that technically critical race theory. I think that, you had the conservative witnesses or Republican lawmakers saying, yeah, that's directly influenced by critical race theory and at its core is made of the same stuff. But is it technically that sort of overt teaching of the critical race theory system, like in like what you would get in a college, like a law school class? No, it's not. So, like, both, it's kind of like this gray area there of, like, it's not specifically like to the T of what maybe a law school student would receive as critical race theory, but there are documented cases. For example, I wrote about this, and I believe we discussed it on the podcast here, in the Evanston-Skokie, Illinois school district, school district 65. It serves up to 8th grade students, I believe. And they had students and staff segregate by race to do professional development and different what they call privilege walks, where they essentially have students. For the students, they had students line up, and then they would tell them to take 2 steps forward or take a step forward, if this was true, and take a step back if this were true, and essentially separate students based on their life experience and race in order to try to prove the point that those who are born to some families have these advantages, and if you're born to a different family, then you have this. And the Department of Education issued a letter of findings saying that it violated federal anti-discrimination law, and that was the Trump Department of Education. And then the Biden administration withdrew that letter after taking office just within a few days and hasn't commented on that since then. So it's one of those things. We have seen this before in schools, and I think that you could make the case very strongly that those are influenced pretty much directly by critical race theory. I've also written about professional development for teachers, where they're drawing directly from critical race theorists, these people who are writing about and are like deep in critical race theory and talking about it. So that's the $1 million question, right? Is critical race theory being taught in schools? It's like yes and no.
So what is the federal government's role in this? Why was this being brought up at a congressional hearing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that the hearing may have served more of just like we're talking about this sort of role than any kind of actual, like we should make a policy recommendation or try to make any motion, like any waves with the federal government. Because a lot of the different lawmakers, including Republicans, Democrats, they all said, the federal government does not have a role in creating curricula and is barred from doing so and should not do that. And Republicans agreed and said, we're not going to do that. And so it's pretty unclear what that is. I think, at a certain point, some of these hearings do get into a lot of theatrics, right? And you had that in this case as well, where the Republicans had panelists on to talk about civics and they had Ian Rowe from the American Enterprise Institute and had somebody from the Jack Miller Center talking about the founding of the country. And then Democrats had a representative from the Bricklayers Union to talk about infrastructure. So basically, how do we fund schools enough so that we can rebuild the crumbling buildings that we have? So it was kind of like a mismatch of priorities here, and that was evident throughout the whole hearing, right? So again, it does kind of get into like, we want to talk about what we want to talk about. Maybe you get a little video made out of it and that kind of thing. Again, a little bit more of the theatrics. So I think that might be, the big reason that they were talking about it, or just kind of spotlight, here's what we think should happen in terms of this. But it's, they're not going to make any decisions about that. And if they were to try to do that from the federal level, they would immediately get slammed with lawsuits. So, I think that Republicans and Democrats both agreed that, the federal level is not the place of defining here's what we should teach students, but maybe more of those guiding principles of, should we be teaching them, how do we teach them about the founding of the country in a way that, reflects American values? And I think that Republicans would obviously be opposed to critical race theory, just because we've seen that in a lot of different states, Republican-led states that have, passed legislation banning discussions of critical race theory and calling it divisive ideology. So I think that is, more of the dialogue there, rather than, let's actually pass something and implement a law regulating what can and can't be taught at a local level.
And you mentioned that the Democrats had witnesses speaking on infrastructure. Was that kind of to the point of saying, like, why are we even talking about this? We should be talking about infrastructure concerns instead? Yeah,
I think so. Representative Suzanne Bonamici, is basically like, we shouldn't be talking about the local curricular issues at all. Again, critical race theory is not being taught, and that we should, be sent, like, what we could do is try to send more money to local school districts to fix crumbling buildings. Like, how can students learn if their building is 100 years old or 80 years old and doesn't have air conditioning? So I think that was sort of the undermining aspect of that, of like, we're not going to go along with this. And I think that is, in terms of trying to take critical race theory head on, I don't think that it might be a little bit more divisive than what most Democrats would want to handle potentially. So that is a very, again, sort of a smart move, I think, to go that direction and say, like, we could be doing that and we're not going to play ball with Republicans here. And we want to move toward, we want to reroute the issue and look at funding and how it plays out for students who are in these old buildings. So I think that is more of a winning issue for them probably, and for trying to, get their ends across.
Well, Brennan, thank you for your insights on this story. Listeners can keep up with this story and more at chalkboardnews.com.